Right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining, or good afternoon, depending on which part of the earth you're from. Welcome to today's session. What we'll be covering is identity management. We've got two great presenters today, by the way, a really good session. So we will be passing over to them fairly soon. Paul has obviously got more letters after his name than is in the alphabet. It's always a good sign. So one of the things we'll be talking about is Oracle security. I want to emphasize why we have this session. This is based on the questions that you have answered on previous sessions about what you wanted. So just trying to prove that we are actually listening. So a couple of things about today's session, just as per normal. For some of you who are regulars on the call, don't adjust your set file. I'll be back next week. So it's just me presenting today. So we've got a couple of things you need to be aware of. There's a few places you can ask questions. There is a chat button on the line at the bottom, and there is a Q&A. Chat is private, right? So if you've got something that you don't want to necessarily share, post there. So Paul, I'll pass over to you, and I'll talk to you all at the far end. Best of luck, Paul.
Thanks, Tom. Let me just get my screen share and then we'll kick off. Okay, great. So thank you for joining. As Tom said, I'm Paul. I work within what we call our technology cloud engineering team, where really I focus on everything to do with security, whether that's data security, identity and access management, cloud security. And I tend to do a lot of conversations around CISO, heads of security, that type of conversation. But today is very much a hands-on type session in that I'm going to talk a little bit about identity management just to set the scene really in terms of why we're looking at doing what we're doing. And then I'm going to walk you through some setup. Got a couple of use cases I want to show you that hopefully you'll find interesting. And you'll find that actually it's not quite as hard and scary as it might first seem. So diving straight in. Well, if my slides haven't hung, there we go. So I'm not specifically going to talk about future capability. Everything I'm talking about today in terms of features and functions and capability is available today. The reason I put the safe harbor statement up is because I am talking about a migration of a capability that will happen at some point next year. So I needed to put the safe harbor statement up. I'll explain more about that as we get there very shortly. So just sort of setting the scene really. We all know the challenges that we've got around sort of security at the moment. I'm talking general security here. You've got your data sat everywhere. It's not just sat in one cloud, it's sat in multiple clouds. It's sat across different data centers. Some of those you might own, some of those you might not own. It's now sat in SaaS. It's not just sat in your own compute. So you've got other organizations controlling it. You've got other organizations mapping it. Everywhere where you've got data, you've typically got identities sat there. We hear a lot about zero trust at the moment and the concept of not trusting things. That might be your systems, it might be your networks, whatever it may be. But all of these challenges really lead us to the fact that there has to be something that becomes this new perimeter. It can't be firewalls. That hasn't happened for a decade, at least. So we start to look at what's a common thread across all of this. We're trying to protect our data. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. Stop the attackers getting to our data. So identity becomes the common theme that sits through all of this. So really, you can start to think really of identity as that new perimeter. Doesn't matter where you're coming in from, what you're trying to get to, ultimately you're trying to access the data, and it's your identity that's going to govern what you're able to do. So identity becomes massively important. Now, if you think about identity from an Oracle point of view, we've been doing it a long time. We have what we call the Oracle IAM suite, which is an enterprise class capability that, I suppose in today's world of cloud, we call it an on-premise capability, something that you typically install yourself, you'd manage yourself, you'd run yourself. And that gives you everything from access management through to identity governance, directory, etc. And we've been doing that for over 20 years now. So we've got a very strong heritage in being leaders within the IAM space. But we've also got a cloud platform. And that cloud platform, we've taken everything we learned from our on-premise and we built it into that cloud platform, into the identity portion of that cloud platform. So we can take those capabilities and we can essentially reap all the benefits of cloud. We can make it easier to use. We can make it easier to manage. We can make it easier to scale. ultimately leaving you with less to have to do, less to have to configure. And you'll see that as we go through and we set this up today. You're not installing any software, you're not managing any HA, any resilience, you're just configuring the service. And that's what we're going to use today. We're going to use the Cloud Identity Platform in order to do that. Now, if you're already using Oracle Clouds, a couple of terms that you might be familiar with from an identity point of view. You might be familiar with what we call OCI IAM, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure Identity and Access Management. That is the core IAM framework that OCI is built around. That's what manages who can log into the OCI console and who can do things. Can I spin up a compute instance? Can I create a new network? Can I create a new database? Can I use database resources? That's what OCI IAM is historically doing. But then you might have also come across IDCS, or Identity Cloud Service. And that is our enterprise class identity and access management platform. As the name suggests, it's a cloud service. And that's not just focused on OCI, that's focused on any enterprise class resources. They might be applications that sit on premise. They might be other cloud-based applications like SaaS applications, for example. And IDCS lets you manage both your Oracle apps and your non-Oracle apps. And what we've been doing recently within Oracle is we've been combining those capabilities together. So now you have Identity Cloud Service merged with OCI IAM. So if you created a new tenancy tomorrow, you would get OCI IAM and what we call an identity domains construct. An identity domains looks and feels very similar to Identity Cloud Service. It has exactly the same capabilities. So you now get all of that enterprise class capability for both Oracle workloads and non-Oracle workloads running across Oracle Cloud and everywhere else, but you now get it in one place. You get it in OCI IAM. And that's the same capability that also manages your access to your OCI resources. So why have we done that? We've done it to make it easier to manage, to make it easier for us to build extra capability moving forward, because we're now doing it in one place. And ultimately, it's about security, it's about reducing risk. And that's really why we've done it. So for the purposes of what we're doing today, I'm actually using the IDCS console rather than the IAM console. It doesn't matter, it's the same capability. You would see the same features and functions if you logged into an identity domain within the new tenancy as you would from IDCS. Moving forward, if you've already got a tenancy that has IDCS today, then that will be migrated automatically to the new identity domains construct. As I say, safe harbor statement applying at some point next year is the current plan. So what do you get from an enterprise class identity and access management capability? Because the whole purpose of this session really is to talk about how you offload identity and access management from your application. If you're developing some new sort of business value service, the last thing you want to do is start writing IAM capability, because it's not adding business value. It's a capability you absolutely need, but you shouldn't have to build it yourself. So if you're looking at a platform, what sort of things do you want the platform to be able to do? So if you start to look at OCI's IAM capability, this new merged capability, then if you sort of look at the top, it's managing policies for what you can and can't do within OCI. Can you log in? Can you create compute instances, etc.? But it's more broader than that. On the left-hand side, it's looking at inbound authentication and single sign-on. How can I log into the IAM platform? And we want a lot of different options. We might want you to be able to use external providers, like another identity provider. Might want you to use a social provider like Google or Facebook or something like that. We might want to strengthen the authentication through things like multi-factor authentication or risk-based authentication. You might have some of your own MFA factors that you want to use. You might have some hardware tokens that you want to use, or some industry standards that you want to use. You might have other directories that you want to integrate into this IAM platform, maybe activedirectory or azure or something like that. So we need to be able to find a way that we can offer lots of different types of authentication, but also then use that authentication to deliver single sign-on using this IAM platform. So that's the inbound capabilities that we're looking at. Once you're into the platform, we need to be able to manage your identity. So we need somewhere to store your identities, and we need some way to manage the life cycle of that user and what they can access and how they can access things, how they get provisioned to different services, etc. So that all sits within the bottom box, which is this identity store and lifecycle management. And then once we've got your identity, we need to think about what are we going to do with that identity. because we want to use that identity to access things. So we might be looking at single sign-on, federated type single sign-on, whether that's cloud-based apps, whether it's on-premise apps, whether it's SaaS apps, whether it's something you've written yourself, it doesn't matter. We can provide single sign-on to all of those. We can also use your same identity to manage things like authentication into databases or into Linux, for example. So broadly speaking, those are the three capabilities or the three areas you need to focus on from IAM: how to get the user in, how to get the user out, and what to do with the user while they're in there in the first place. And these are all capabilities that we can deliver through the IAM platform. From a developer point of view, if you're going to say, well, okay, I want to use that platform. I don't want to be building my own MFA in my application. I don't want to build my own single sign-on into my application. I just want something else that's going to tell me when a new user turns up. Or I want to be able to tell it when I want to add a user to a group, for example, or do something with the user. Then you need a way of integrating with that IAM platform. And the nice thing is identity is very mature, not just in terms of what OCI IAM can do, but generally in terms of open standards. The identity marketplace is a mature marketplace. There are lots of open standards out there that we can take advantage of. And the OCI IAM service indeed takes advantage of those. So you can see some of these here: OAuth, FIDO, SAML, OpenID Connect, SCIM. All of these are open standards that are supported by the OCI IAM platform. In addition to that, it's an API first platform. So everything you can do in the console, you can also do via a REST API. On top of that, we provide various different samples. We provide SDKs that help wrapper these REST APIs. And we also provide samples for things like custom applications, those sorts of things. So there's lots of resources that help you get started a lot quicker. If you just need to quickly integrate your application via SAML, great, use the open standard. If you want to quickly integrate your application through OpenID Connect, great, use the standard. If you want to use a hardware token, use FIDO 2, that sort of thing. So there's plenty of capability available for you to integrate with this very easily without you having to try and rewrite this capability yourself within your own application. So enough slides. I'm bored of slides now, and I'm sure you are. So let's get into the meat of what we're going to be looking at today. So I'll give you a quick overview of what I've built from a demo environment perspective, just to set the scene. I've done all of this within OCI, within the cloud, and we're going to use a couple of different resources. So I'm going to show you what we've set up. Then the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a WordPress site, fairly vanilla, freshly installed WordPress site, and we're going to integrate it with the OCI IAM platform. And we're going to build this in real time. So you're going to show how you can offload authentication into WordPress out to OCI's IAM. We're then going to do the same for modern enterprise type application. We're going to look at Apex. And we're going to take our low-code development environment, Apex, and we're going to integrate that with identity management. And then we're going to start to show how we can use this integration to really start to launch additional capability. Because what if I want to turn on multi-factor authentication for Apex? Well, again, I don't want to have to build that into my application. I don't want to have to build multi-factor authentication into Apex. So we'll see how we can very quickly turn that on within the identity and access management platform, and how we can get that enforced when you try and log into Apex. And then finally, we're going to look at how you might use a third-party identity provider, but how you can still layer security on top of that. So you might be using something like Azure, which is what we'll use in the demo. All your users might authenticate there, but you might not have implemented multi-factor authentication there. So how could we step up authentication within the identity service of OCI, but still allow you to leverage the authentication credentials from something like Azure? So that's the plan. Hopefully you'll find these use cases interesting. If you do have any questions throughout, then Olaf's poised, waiting to answer your Q&A. So feel free to fire anything up there that you want to ask. In the meantime, I'm going to get Firefox loaded. And let's just get rid of some of these screens, some of these boxes, so things aren't in the way. Okay, so let me give you a very quick rundown of what we've got configured here. Let me just make my screen a little bit bigger. I don't know if that affects you or not, but it helps me. Okay, so get out of the way. There we go. That's better. So I'm logged into OCI. I'm logged into a tenancy, and there's a couple of things I've got configured here. So if I go and look at my compute instances, I've got a standard compute instance running. On it, I've installed Docker, and then within Docker, I've installed WordPress fairly simple, very quick to get up and running. You'll see if I look at this WordPress instance, it sits on a private subnet, so it's not internet accessible by itself. But what I have done is I've taken networking, I've created a load balancer. And the load balancer is a public load balancer, hence why it's got a public IP address. And that load balancer is attached to my backend WordPress. And if I look at the listeners, you'll see that I've configured a TLS listener. I'm using the certificate service within OCI to generate a digital certificate, which I've then loaded into here, and I'm using that. So I'm exposing my load balancer over 443, over TLS to the internet, and that's then talking at the back end out to my WordPress instance. Okay, so that's WordPress. Apex, pretty similar. I've spun up a database, which is an autonomous data warehouse to make it nice and quick and easy. So we've got student 50 sat here. And then on the front of that, we've got an Apex service running. Again, that's just student 50. And that's what we're going to integrate with IDCS or OCI IAM if you prefer. So enough clicking around the consoles. Let's start by actually going in. So if you look at our WordPress instance, if I just do a refresh here, you'll see it's fairly vanilla. In fact, it is very vanilla. This is the standard out the box. There's nothing special about it. I've logged in as admin. So if I go to here, I can get the admin dashboard. I've got nothing special installed. It's just a fairly vanilla site. So to integrate this with identity, if I was just logging in normally, I'd create a user, I'd give the user a role and mess about all within here. I don't want to do that. I want to do identity externally. I've already got my IAM platform. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start within Identity Cloud Service. Let's say if you've already got an OCI tenancy, you're probably familiar with Identity Cloud Service. If you're spinning up a new tenancy now, you'll probably get the new identity domains capability. Same features, just in a slightly different looking UI because it's built now within this UI rather than a separate UI. So if you think about how you integrate WordPress with an identity management system, first you have to tell the identity management system that WordPress can talk to it, or that something external can talk to it. And you do that by creating an application. Once you've done that, you then go into WordPress and tell it how to talk to the Identity Cloud Service. So we're going to start within IDCS. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an application. So I'm going to add a new app, and I'm going to create a confidential application because this is going to use OAuth 2. So I'm just going to use OpenID Connect. So I give it a name. So I'm going to call it WordPress Student 50. And I don't need to configure all these. In the interest of time, I'm not going to put in all these different URLs. If I wanted to start launching this application from this console, then I could fill in all these. I don't need to do that for this. Okay, so I've created the application. Because of the way that OpenID Connect works, I need to give it a resource that it's going to use so that when WordPress makes a call to identity, it does it under what we call it gives it a scope, which basically says what it can access. So I'm going to set that up here. So firstly, I need to give it an audience. One thing that you might not have seen is if I go to my WordPress site, I'm using this DNS entry called student50.ociexperience.com. So that is my primary audience. So I might as well copy and paste that. And then I need to create this scope. So the scope is just everything. Depending on how your OAuth implementation works, you might have different scopes that give you different access to things. I'm just going to use /, which means everything. I'm going to add that resource in there. So I've now configured this resource and I can go back and use that resource now. So I can set up my client. So this is what's going to allow WordPress to talk to IDCS because it'll have this client configured. So I tell it which types of tokens and which types of grant types is going to be allowed, which in this case is not going to be resource zone, it's going to be client credentials. So client creds, refresh token, and authorization code. I give it a redirect URL, which is the same redirect URL as my primary audience. And then down here, I give it the resource. And the resource is the one that I've just created, which is this student 50. You can see there, I've got the resource type with the trailing / on the end, and I add that as my resource. Okay. And that's it. So I go through, I complete this, click next, click next, click next, and finish. So that gives me a client ID and secret. I'll put these into WordPress so that WordPress can authenticate essentially to make API calls to IDCS. So I'm just making a note of those and copying those into Notepad. And the final thing I have to do within IDCS is I have to activate. So I hit activate, and that essentially enables the application. So from an IDCS point of view, we're now done. We've configured a confidential application that WordPress will use when it wants to talk to IDCS using the OpenID Connect standard. So the next thing we need to do is go into WordPress and configure it to do that. So we're going to do that by using a plugin. So if I go to my plugins at the moment, you'll see I've got the standard 2 that you get out of the box. I'm going to add a new one. And we're going to search for OAuth and see what OAuth plugins are out there. And we've got this one here, the OAuth single sign-on SSO OAuth client. That sounds remarkably like something that we want, because we want to be talking OAuth or OpenID Connect. So I'm going to install that one. That's installed, and then we activate it. Okay, so now we need to set it up. We need to configure it. So because IDCS doesn't sit in the list of pre-built integrations here, we're going to do a custom OpenID Connect application. So this is a fairly straightforward wizard. There's not a lot I need to configure. So I need to give it a callback URL. Where's it going to send requests back to? So that's fine. It's picked the default, which is its own URL. So that's fine. I give it a name. So let's just call it IDCS. And then it's going to ask for a couple of URLs. There's a couple of ways I can get these. There's a URL provided by IDCS where I could discover them. Or in my case, just in the interest of time, I'm just going to copy them because I've already got them noted here. Make sure there's no spaces in there, just to make sure we don't have any problems. Okay. So I have an authorization endpoint where I go to effectively authenticate, and then we have the token endpoint, which is where I can send token requests. So now it's asking for the authentication credentials that we copied earlier from IDCS. This is how WordPress is going to authenticate itself so it can make API calls to IDCS. Okay. And it asks for the scope. Well, we know what the scope is because we've already defined it. So student50.oci.experience.com, and we've got to have the trailing slash. Remember, the trailing slash is massively important because that's the scope. Okay, so that's done essentially. So I can now, we don't want to save that, I can hit finish and finish again. Okay, so I've got this application set up. Now, the way that this particular plugin works is one more thing I have to do. I have to go in the application and I have to tell it which attribute from the token it receives it wants to map to username. Now, as you can see here, before I can do that, it actually needs a token that it can extract the values from. So what I need to just do first is I need to edit application and I need to test configuration. Now, what that's doing, if I just share a different screen, it's popped up a little pop-up box. I'm already logged into IDCS. I'm logged in as me. You can see I'm logged in there. So it's asking for consent. It's OpenID Connect. It's asking for consent. Do I want to allow to share my personal information with this particular client? Well, I do. I'm going to allow that. So that then goes back and it sends back a test token. And that token contains all these different attributes. So now I've done that, if I go back to my other sharing screen, which is my main browser, now if I go back into attribute role mapping, I've got a drop-down list that I can select any of the attributes in the token from. And I'm going to pick sub, because sub is the one that I want to use, which is short subject. Okay, so that's it. That's configured. So now if I open a new browser, and I share my new browser screen, wherever that is, if I open the Chrome one, and if I go to this URL, I'm going to paste it in there. Okay, so let's find a blog, and let's log in to reply to it. So I can log in locally, or I can now log in with IDCS. So if I do that, it's asking me to authenticate. So I can log in as me, grab my password, which is there. Now, I've already given consent because I gave it when I ran that test. So it's not asking me again, but you can see I'm now logged in the corner as me. So that shows that that integration is working. I'm not logged in directly to WordPress. I've logged in via Identity Cloud Service. So hopefully that was fairly straightforward. Hopefully that all makes sense. So now looking at our next use case, if we go back to our Firefox screen, we sort of finished with WordPress for now. We're done with WordPress. What we do need to do is we need to do Apex. We need to look at how we integrate Apex this time. Now, the process is remarkably similar. The first thing we have to do is we set up Identity Cloud Service. We tell it that we have an application that's going to want to talk to it and how it's going to want to talk to it. So I'm going to go back to applications. I'm going to go to add. And again, I'm going to add another confidential application. And this one I'm going to call Apex Student 50. Okay. So I'm going to configure it as a client. I'm going to tell it it wants authorization code. And I'm going to give it a redirect URL, which I've copied into Notepad just in the interest of time. So essentially, this callback URL is the URL of the instance that I've got. So notice it's a VX something dash student 50. And that's my URL of my Apex instance, VX something dash student 50. And then I just add some Apex specific stuff on the end, which is the listener, which is odds, and then the callback URL. So I provide that. Okay. And to be honest, that's it. The way that this particular integration works, that's all I need to do. All I'm really looking for is a mechanism to allow Apex in this case to talk to IDCS. So I can go through, click finish, finish, finish. Again, I grab a client ID and secret, and I'm going to need those. So I'll just paste those into Notepad off the screen. Just gets easier. And then exactly the same as last time, the last step I need to do is I need to activate it. So I'll hit activate, and that enables that application. So we've now got our two applications, WordPress and Apex. So I can go into Apex now. I can log into my Apex instance. In fact, let's log in from the start, and you can see it all from the beginning. So my workspace is called demo. My username is admin. And my password is something that you don't need to know. Okay, so I'm now logged into Apex. And I've got two applications, so sample applications deployed. I've got a sample approvals apps and I've got a sample calendar. We're actually going to integrate the sample calendar in this case. So I go into this application. It's just one of the samples off the gallery. It's not one I've written myself. And I go into shared components. And there's two things I need to set up within Apex. The first is the client ID and secret. I need to register those as a set of credentials. So I do that down here within credentials. I create a new credential. Let's call it IDCS client creds. Doesn't really matter what I call it. And it's basic authentication. And then I need to paste that client ID and secret that I've just literally copied from IDCS. So I've pasted those in there, validated, verified the password. We've now got this new set of creds. Now that I've got those, I can create what we call an authentication scheme. So again, Apex is very similar to WordPress. If I don't do anything else, if I try and log into Apex, it's going to present me a username and password box. And it's going to ask me to log in locally against a user that I've created directly within Apex. And I don't want to do that. I want to create a new application. Oh, sorry, a new authentication scheme. I could do that based on a gallery application because I don't have an existing one to copy. So let's give our authentication scheme a name. And the type is social sign-in. So social sign-in typically means it's using OAuth or OpenID Connect. So using social sign-in, in this case, it's OAuth. So it asks me which credential I want to use, which is the one that I've just created, IDCS client creds. And it's telling me it's going to be an OpenID Connect provider. Now, this one works slightly differently to WordPress. If you remember, within WordPress, I had to define the authorization endpoint and the token endpoint. But this one's working slightly differently. What it's asking me to do is provide what we call a discovery URL, which is a URL that IDCS publishes, which is .well-known OpenID config. And then Apex will grab the other URLs that it needs to know from there. Okay. So the scope is profile, and my username in this case, just like last time, I'm going to use sub. Okay. And that's all I need to find. I don't need to find the rest of it. So all I've told it is there's a client ID in secret, there's a discovery URL, and when the token comes in, I want you to extract the username from it from the sub attribute. Oh, and by the way, when you request a scope, I want you to request a profile scope. So what happens with Apex is when I create that, it automatically makes that the current authentication scheme. Okay, that's how it works. So now if I go back to my sample calendar and I run the application, then it doesn't ask me to log in locally. It automatically kicks in the IDCS authentication scheme. It redirects me to IDCS where, because I'm in the same browser, I'm already logged in. I'm logged in as me. So just like before, it knows I'm logged in as me. It knows I'm trying to get to this application. Remember, that's what we called it within IDCS. And it's requesting the scope of profile, which is one of the standard OpenID Connect scope types. So I can decide whether I want to give it consent to share the information from that profile to Apex. Well, I do. So I allow that. And that's it. I'm logged in. So I'm now logged into the sample calendar application. I'm logged in as me. And I've done that without having to start messing about writing any code within Apex or started messing about like that. I've used my enterprise identity store to enable me to authenticate against Apex. So I've now got a side benefit of this. I've got WordPress and I've got Apex. So what we'll find now is if I open, again, let's do a new browser. Let's open a completely fresh Chrome browser and let's share that one there. So let's go back to my sample calendar app. Redirects me straight to IDCS where I can log in. So I'm now logged into the sample calendar. But if I also go to my LCI student /WP admin, actually I won't do WP admin. Let's go to the home page. If I go to an article, I log into reply, log into IDCS, I've got single sign-on. It's not asking me to authenticate again because I'm already logged into IDCS, because I logged in as part of the sample calendar app. Then as soon as I try and hit anything that's already integrated with IDCS, subject to any other sign-in policy that would stop me, then I'm just logged in. You'll notice that I've got single sign-on here already. Okay, so that's fairly straightforward. Hopefully, you understand what we've had to do to integrate both of those applications with IDCS, and you've seen Apex and WordPress both get integrated. So what next? What if we wanted to turn on multi-factor authentication? What if we want to say, in order to get to this sample application, I want you to give me another token, some sort of additional factor? Well, now that we've got the application deployed in IDCS, we've got our users in IDCS. So you can see I've got a big list of users here, and we've got our groups in IDCS. So it's fairly easy to turn on multi-factor authentication. So I've created a group here called MFA for Apex. If we look at that group, you'll see it's got two users in it. It's got me, and it's got a different version of me, which you'll see in a minute. So it's got two users. If I look at MFA within IDCS, then you'll see that we support a whole bunch of different factors. Security questions, or what you tend to think of as knowledge-based authentication. You can do mobile app passcode, which is any of these authenticator type apps that generate 6-digit codes that change every 30 or 60 seconds. We can do mobile app notification. You'll see that in a minute, where we can do a push notification to your phone. We can do things like SMS or voice calling. We can send you codes via email. We can give you a set of bypass codes. Or if you've got any type of FIDO type authenticator, including things like Touch ID, Face ID, Windows Hello, YubiKeys, any of those. We can use all of those through the FIDO authenticator. There's a lot of different settings here that I'm not going to mess about with today. But you can see I can enable at a global level within IDCS which factors I want to enable. Now I want to tell IDCS that whenever you try and go to Apex, if you're in a certain group, I want you to authenticate with a multi-factor token. So I go to single sign-on policies or sign-on policies. I'm going to create a new sign-on policy. And I'm going to call this MFA for Apex. I then create a sign-on rule. And let's again call it MFA for Apex. So I've got a load of conditions I can use here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk through all of these. I'm going to pick a group. I'm going to say anybody who's in the MFA for Apex group, then what I want you to do, the action, I want to allow you to access what I'm going to protect, but I want to prompt you for an additional factor. I can start to limit which factors you're allowed to use. If you're not registered for a particular factor they want you to use, I can enforce the registration of that factor. But in my case, I'm going to be quite kind. I'm going to say you can use any factor that you've registered, but I am going to ask you to do it every single time. If you're not already enrolled for any factor, then you'll be required to enroll, or I can make that optional, but I'm going to leave that as required. So I've created the rule. The next thing I need to do is assign it to an application. And in my case, I'm going to assign it to Apex. That's done. So finish that. And that's now created. If I look at my sign-on policies, I've got this MFA for Apex. I just need to activate it. Okay, so that's done. So again, let's open up a new browser. Share that. Okay, and let's grab the URL of my sample calendar, which is my Apex application. Let's stick that in there. Oh, sorry, what have we done there? What have we broken there? Where's my sample calendar at? That one. I think I've got the wrong URL. There we go. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to log in, username and password. Then it's going to ask me for a notification. So all being well, what I should be able to do is from here, I should be able to share my screen on my phone. Okay, just share that. Okay, there we go. And if I go back to, if I go to my authenticator app, then I'm getting what we call a push notification. So you can see it's asking me, I'm trying to log in to Apex Student 50 as me. This is where I'm coming from. This is where, and this is what browser I'm using. Do I want to allow or deny it? In this case, I'm going to allow it. So login allowed. And if I now go back to my sample calendar application. Oops, sorry, wrong screen. If I go back to my other screen, which is a Chrome one that we were using, you'll see that I'm logged in as me. Okay. So just quit that. So what have I done there? I've logged into the sample calendar application, but I've enabled multi-factor authentication. So actually, before I get there, I've now got to use this two-factor token. I haven't had to write anything in Apex. I could do the same for WordPress. I wouldn't have to write anything in WordPress either, because all of that work around the multi-factor authentication is all been done outside of the application. It's all been done by Identity Cloud Service. Similarly, if I was in IDCS and I looked at things like adaptive security, I could start to look at introducing things like risk levels and different types of risky events and how I handle users if risky events happen. The last thing I want is to write all that within my application. I want something external to do that for me within my identity and access management platform. And that's what the sorts of things we can do within IDCS. So the last thing that I want to show you as part of this demonstration is how that might look if you wanted to integrate it with an external identity provider. So again, let me start a completely fresh browser. And let me share that browser. And we're going to go to our sample calendar app again. And that will redirect me to IDCS. Now this time, let's assume that I don't want to log into IDCS because as an organization, you might already have an external identity provider. You might have Azure. So in this case, you'll see I've integrated Azure already with IDCS, just in the interest of time, because I didn't have time to do it while we were on the phone. Doesn't take long, takes about 10 minutes. So I can click off to Azure. I can pick a user to log in with, and that's where this other version of me comes in, this paul.toal@emiacloudpursuit.com. So I can authenticate to Azure, grab my password, which is there. I don't want to stay signed in. So it redirects me back, but again, MFA is enforced. So even though Azure might not have MFA turned on for this particular user or for its organization generally, it's turned on within, in my case, Identity Cloud Service. So it's still asking me for that second factor. So if I log into my phone, I won't share the screen again, and I hit allow, then it lets me in. Because it's the first time I've logged in as this particular user, because every other time I was logging in as paul.toal@oracle.com, because I'm logging in as this particular user, I get the consent box. I choose to consent, and it now logs me in, and I'm logged into the sample application. You can see in the corner that I'm logged in as me. So we've covered quite a lot there. The one thing that I would say is, in addition to that login screen that you saw, where I selected to either log in locally to IDCS or I chose to click the button to go to Azure, we can automate that. We can streamline that. We can take you there automatically based on maybe where you're coming from. If you're coming from a corporate location, corporate IP address, we could take you straight to Azure. We could ask you for your username, and depending on what your username looks like, we could take you straight to Azure, or we could take you to a different IDP, or we could ask you to log in locally, or we could do a passwordless authentication and go straight to something like a FIDO device. All this is options that we have available to us within Identity Cloud Service that you'd have to build if you were trying to build identity management directly into any of your applications. So hopefully you can see the sheer amount of capability that you get using something like Identity Cloud Service or OCI's IAM. You just get all that out the box. You don't need to worry about it. You don't need to set it up. In terms of installing anything, you literally need to do a bit of configuration. Click a few simple screens to turn it on, work out what sort of MFA you want, work out what sort of risk factors you want to take into account, integrate the different applications through the open standards like SAML, like OpenID Connect, like header variables, that sort of thing. And then you've got all your outbound applications, you've got all your different inbound authentication mechanisms, you've got single sign-on by default out the box, and then you're just managing the identity and the identity across these different sources. So hopefully that was useful. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand back to Tom, see if there's any questions that are raised that we might want to maybe discuss live or anything like that.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Much appreciated. If I know Olaf's keyboard is melting over there with the Q&A, but anyway, so thanks, Olaf, for picking that up.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have an open question which Paul might want to answer.
Sure.
Fine.
Let me have a look. Open question. Apex and WordPress are prepared for SSO/remote authentication. What do I need to add this awareness to my custom application? Okay, so really they were prepared in terms of, WordPress vanilla isn't prepared for anything. Apex, it gives you the authentication schemes that you can configure. So yes, you could argue that's prepared in a way. WordPress, the only reason it's prepared is because somebody's written a plugin to do it. So if you're using something like JavaScript or any other type application, if there's some sort of package framework or module framework with that language, there's usually a module or a package that you can use that would enable things like OpenID Connect or things like SAML or OAuth. Typically for things like JavaScript, it'd be more OAuth OpenID Connect than it would SAML. SAML tends to be a bit more for the older type applications. But yeah, usually there's some sort of package available that would give you that that jump start. So effectively, you install the module, you install the package, and then you just give it the configuration settings you need. Anything to add to that, Olaf?
Well, as you said, there are several packages available. Pick and choose the one that fits in your development style, and you should be happy with that.
The one thing I would say as well is we didn't really touch on it here, but we talked very much about open standards like SAML and OAuth and OpenID Connect. That's really the modern ways that you would integrate an application. But I've been doing identity way before SAML was a standard. And in the older days, and the reason I mention this is because a lot of people do still have legacy applications out there. In the older days, not all applications supported SAML, or they didn't all support OpenID or OAuth. And it was very common in those days that if an application was SSO enabled, in inverted commas, you could configure it to accept a header variable. So rather than prompt for username and password, it would look for a header variable containing the username in the inbound header stream. If it found that, it would extract that username and it would look the user up based on that. Think of it as a trusted header, is what they used to call it. So we can support that capability within OCI IAM. We have what we call an app gateway, which essentially is a reverse proxy to all intents and purposes. And that can, once the user is authenticated, it can intercept a request to an application, authenticate the user through the IDAM service. Once the user is authenticated, it can inject that same header variable into the inbound header stream. So that any application that doesn't support standards like SAML and OAuth can still be SSO enabled through the use of header variables. There are some other considerations you need to take into account around locking down where requests to your application can come from, that sort of thing. But it's a standard pattern. We've been doing it for years. So if you do have a legacy app that doesn't support the standards, and they are becoming fewer and more far less widespread, then there are still options available for you. But by far, I would say any modern application these days, OAuth, OpenID Connect are going to be your friends.
So finally, just thank everyone for attending. Olaf, thanks for answering all the questions. Paul, awesome demo. Mucho gracias. That's the only Spanish I know, by the way, just so in case you're wondering. But if anybody's got further questions, remember the boost call. It's on the chat. You can follow up there. The DevRel Slack channel, please join up over there. It's a lot of good stuff. And obviously, if you're really stuck in that, you can't get anywhere else, feel free to email us. If there's no more questions, actually, hold on, I know what else. Okay, you're most welcome, Danny. With that, I'll thank everybody for joining, and I'll hopefully see you all on the next session. Have a great day.